Welcome to Global Connections on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. This episode is called Getting Current on the Philippines. How are the Philippines doing in the contention with China? Our guest for the show is Carl Baker, Senior Advisor, Pacific Forum. Welcome to the show, Carl.
Yeah, good to be here, Jay. Always interesting to talk about the Philippines. I think that's one of the first shows I did with Global Connections a long time ago.
Well, a lot has happened. Philippines, as we know, is an important strategic ally in the Pacific. We need to follow what is going on there, see how they're doing. And we have to maintain good relations and cooperative security with them. It's not easy. In fact, it seems to be pretty complicated. So what's the role of the Philippines as a strategic ally of the U.S. and as a location for U.S. bases?
Yeah, well, obviously it's changed a lot over the years. During the Cold War, it was very much a hub for the United States with a big Navy base, a big Air Force base. And in the 90s, early 90s, we left. In the halcyon days of the unipolar world, we decided that we would rather have places rather than bases in Southeast Asia. So the idea was that we could actually do without those big bases, and the Philippines felt the same way, and so we left. And then only in the late 90s did we begin to rebuild those relationships. And we now have a relationship with the Philippines that still is based on the Mutual Defense Treaty, hence the strategic partner. But it's also much reduced in scope, where we still have, now there's a total of 9 bases where we're basically putting in infrastructure and being able to place forces there, but nothing on a permanent basis. And everything is still owned by the Philippines. So it's a much different relationship than it was back in the Cold War, but it has become more robust in recent years as the United States recognizes the threat from China. And the Philippines has also begun to shift its focus away from internal defense to external defense, and specifically trying to counter the influence of China in the South China Sea.
I want to ask you about that, but before we go to that, I want to tell you a short story. When I was in the Coast Guard had a small airport base in the Philippines. And it's important because the Coast Guard, did various navigational aids in the area, and they had business to do, so they needed this base, and they had this base for quite some time. But one day, one of the neighbors, a farmer, approached the Coast Guard and said, "Wait a minute, that base belongs to me. I own that land. You're going to have to pay me." And so the Coast Guard, trying to avoid a controversy, paid him. A week later, another guy comes, another farmer, and he said, "No, no, no, no. It belongs to me. You have to pay me." And after a while, it was like birds of a feather. If you ever had a bird feeder, you know how that works. You put the food out there, and then all of a sudden, all the birds come. And that's what happened here. And the Coast Guard was paying a lot of people a lot of money for very questionable claims to the land. I don't remember the end of the story, but my best recollection is the Coast Guard just gave it up.
Yeah, I say I don't remember the Coast Guard being there even in the 70s. So it could be that they had already given it up by then. Yeah, well, the relationship between the Philippines and the United States, as I said, has blown hot and cold, and it certainly is fraught with lots of controversies, like whose land is it, and to what extent do we give the Philippines agency in the relationship? I think that's been the big issue for the Philippines is to what extent are we really partners, and what extent are we old colonialists? Because there certainly is the mindset in the Philippines that the United States was the colonial master at one point, and there's a lot of hard feelings about that. And so, yeah, and similar things happened with the big bases. Was the idea of paying rent for that land to the Philippine government. And so it has been a difficult relationship. And again, only in the last, really since the Marcos administration, that they've made a strong commitment to sort of resurrecting the relationship as a military alliance or a military partnership.
If you go on YouTube, Carl, it's very interesting. You see these videos of beautiful, beautiful natural habitat all around. There are thousands of islands in the Philippines, and there are the most beautiful, spectacular places, that are just lovely. On the other hand, there are also slums as far as the eye can see. And one of the things I learned from my my video viewing on YouTube about the Philippines, preparation for this show, is that the Philippines has a relatively low GDP, and per capita it's really quite low. It's lower than any of the other countries around there, which have similar resources. And the question posed in the video I'm thinking of was why? Why is that? Because why can't they have a higher GDP? Why can't they have a better quality of life? Why can't they have less poverty? Really stunning poverty all around the country. And the answer was corruption and government that is based in corruption. And these other places are not completely without corruption, but they're not nearly as bad as the Philippines. So if you wanted to, take a trip or build a hotel or start a business, what have you, in the Philippines, you would be met with this level of corruption. And it is so tragic that the Philippines could be a much more, thriving, beneficial environment, country, but it holds itself back by virtue of the corruption. And no government in recent times has been other than corrupt. And this is really sad. Your thoughts?
Certainly there's corruption in the Philippines. Whether it's worse than the other countries around it, I don't know. I mean, to me, I'm more along the argument that the real problem is the lack of willingness of the very wealthy Filipinos to reinvest into the country. When you look at the other countries in the region that you're comparing it to, there's been a willingness to invest in the country, where up until maybe 10, 15 years ago, the really wealthy Filipinos were much more interested in bringing that money outside of the country rather than reinvesting it into the country. And so I think actually the Philippines is one of the fastest growing economies these days in Southeast Asia. And part of the reason is because there is this new willingness to invest and the new willingness to build infrastructure. And so I think my story for the Philippines is a little bit different than the problem with corruption. Certainly there's a corruption problem, but I think that the Philippines is actually turning a corner with the willingness to develop infrastructure, build infrastructure, and certainly the Japanese are very much influential in facilitating that. So so I think that the Philippines has a brighter outlook than the past. So simply because it's looking to the future, it's trying to build infrastructure. So you see subways, trains, all this sort of thing happening now, where in the past there simply wasn't the resources to do it.
Yeah, but let's go back to the question of the quality of government. I look for the news, and the news is all about Sierra Duterte. She's being tried for some national crime, and it's big news every day. Yeah, corruption. Oh, thank you,
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah.
And and there's all kinds of criticism of the efficacy of the government, the willingness of the government, as you say, to distribute wealth in a way so that there's some equality. I guess the point that I saw being made was that the government has not been effective. It hasn't been. It's a democratic government theoretically, but it hasn't been an effective government for a long time. So as a result, it's hard to get anything done. God, this sounds like where the United States may very well be going, especially after today. The redistribution of wealth to the wealthy, and a government that can't seem to get anything done. Why does that sound so familiar? In any event, I'm wondering your thoughts about the efficacy of the government as a democratic government.
Yeah, well, funny you should say you see a vision of the United States in the Philippines, because I think that's a fairly accurate assessment. The problems with the Philippine government is, first of all, you need to understand that Philippine news media is probably even worse than the United States in the sense that the opposition is very much the news media is owned by the different parties or by the different factions. Parties in the Philippines are very weak, but the fact is that the media itself is very much controlled by political factions. And so, depending on what media you're watching, you have a very positive view and a very negative view. Sound familiar?
You bet, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, you can start seeing these similarities. So yeah, the efficacy of government. You need to be careful who you're watching and listening to, because you see one side that says this is the greatest bill that's ever passed in the Philippine legislature, and the other side saying this is devastating because it's going to exacerbate the distribution of wealth. So yeah, I think that, but certainly there is this huge problem in the Philippines with inequitable distribution of wealth. And there the oligarchs simply control everything, and there's that goes all the way through the legislature. It goes into the presidencies. Everything is political. Much probably worse than the United States, but you can certainly look at the Philippines and see some of the things that are happening in the United States. Yeah.
So we have phenomena to see as a metric, as a canary in the coal mine. We have Marcos, we have Imelda Marcos, we have Duterte, who killed people for drug infractions, and I suppose others. And they're phenomena that are not really consistent with a democratic government, not consistent with civil rights or human rights. What does this tell us about the Philippines? Is this something that happened and is over now, or is this something that is intrinsic?
I think that it's intrinsic in the sense that this has been in place for a long time. And remember, the Philippines was created in the Americans' image. And there's a very good book out in our image. And it talks about how the United States put a form of government in the Philippines that wasn't really consistent with Philippine culture. And so that form of government has never really worked all that well in the Philippines. And yeah, there's political parties, but the political parties are sort of meaningless. Every time you have a new presidential candidate, you have a new political party that is really this candidate's populist movement, and so you don't really have strong political institutions beyond this populist vote getting, vote buying, and you have literally the legislator is 80% controlled by political families, and so it's very much politicized, and it's very much a populist kind of government.
I saw a reference to dynasties. There are some areas of the Philippines that are under the control of a given family for generations upon generations. This is not healthy because they turn to be oligarchs. That's what happens. Yeah. But I wanted to ask you about this culture. You referred to the culture. My recollection is that in the 16th century, up to the early part of the 16th century, the Philippines, which is thousands of islands, was largely Muslim. It was Islamic. Various sects of Islamic, but it was Islamic that came from the West. And then Magellan happened, and Magellan brought Catholicism. Magellan brought Spanish culture, which, as you say, may not have been consistent with what had happened before. There was a pretty dramatic change from a country of 7,000 islands which were Islamic, and various, sects of Islamic, to Spanish culture. By the way, Magellan was unsuccessful in his first efforts, and I think he ran into some real violence. But he came back, and Spain came back. And by the end of the 16th century, it was clear that the Philippines were going to be Catholic. But what about that, transition? Is that a transition that helps the culture, hurts the culture? Is it still a contention that lives today?
I don't want to talk about culture in the past. I want to talk about present culture. And I think what we have in the Philippines today is you still have this tension between what they call the Ilustrados and the nationalists. And from the colonial times, and Spanish colonial times in particular, you had the Ilustrados who basically were proxies for the colonialists. And again, like you say, from 1600 to 1905, it was the Spanish that controlled the Philippines, or I guess 1898, if you want to pick that date. But so you had the competition between the Ilustrados and the nationalists, and it's embedded in Philippine culture that there's always this tension. And in some ways, Duterte represented one of the last nationalists in power. And Marcos very much represents one of the Ilustrados, because they were always accommodating to the colonialists. And Marcos is really that, from that side of the cultural equation, the political cultural equation. So I think I want to frame it in terms of the nationalists versus the Ilustrados, because that's really where the political tension is. And the Ilustrados, of course, are from wealthy families. The nationalists have always been sort of the underdogs, but they've been the national heroes. So even going back to Aguinaldo versus the nationalists in the 1898 to 1905 era, when the United States was becoming the colonial ruler in the Philippines, you had that tension between those two groups of people, and that has certainly hampered the Philippines' ability to develop its own political culture.
Talk about all these former colonial countries, and certainly the Philippines has been a colonial country for a long time, in one way or another, under the U.S., for example, post 1898. And I really wonder whether it's possible to escape being a colonial country and be independent and do better at it. So many places in Africa, like they were colonial countries, but when they got independent, things did not get better, and you can see that on the map every day. And here, I wonder your thoughts, and I'm really not familiar with this. I wonder your thoughts about this. So the U.S. is a colonial power controlling the Philippines until, say, sometime shortly after the war, I guess. And sometime after the war, the Philippines became independent. Did that help? Did getting out from under American colonialism, and for that matter, Spanish colonialism before, did that help when they got independent?
No, I mean, again, they were sort of strapped with this political system that was developed based on the United States. So it's a presidential system. It has a legislature and a very weak Supreme Court, and so it struggled with that, and that's part of the corruption. Is the legislature is rife with corruption, because, as you say, it's political dynasties that really control the country, and you have these family feuds that go on for generations. Where every once in a while you'll see in the news where there was this killing in a rural area in the Philippines, and it really is a family feud that's driving that. And so when you have political campaigns, it's all about handouts. It's all about buying votes, and yeah, it's just a huge amount of corruption within the political system itself. And so, my hope has always been for the Philippines is that it would learn to demand agency. Again, I'm going back to my theme here of agency, that there has to be a way to give the Filipinos agency in their relationship with the United States. Now, actually, after the bases were moved out, or after the United States moved up away from the bases in the early 90s, there has been a better effort at giving the Philippines agency through the Visiting Forces Agreement, through the revised bases agreement, because they've avoided allowing the United States to actually build huge military presence in the Philippines without the uh, influence from the Philippine government in what's happening on those bases. So it's gotten better, but it still has a long way to go. And the political system itself is still quite broken. So you have the political dynasties, the Arroyos, the Cojuangcos, the Marcoses, and then just recently the Dutertes. The Dutertes aren't really part of the original establishment. They're really based out of Mindanao, out of the southern part, and the rest of them are mostly based out of the Christian parts. Duterte is a Christian, but he's from Davao, which is largely populated by the Muslims. But the Christians have moved into that part of Mindanao, where the other part of Mindanao is still very strongly Muslim and is actually a separate autonomous region from the rest of the Philippines. And so that's another part of that problem that you're talking about the historical problem, is there's still areas in the Philippines that are considered autonomous regions. And so while Catholics dominate the central government and the central part of the Philippines, Mindanao is still very, very much controlled by Muslims, where in the north you have indigenous groups that haven't really ever been controlled by either the Spanish or, for that matter, the Americans.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the guerrillas. I guess popular information would be that there is an awful lot of violent guerrillas. I don't know what name you put on them, but there are various groups all around the Philippines that would like to, shoot and kill people and have no regard for peace or security or the government. What about them? How do they exist? And why can't the Filipino government stop them?
You're right. I mean, there's various groups. I would classify them. There's the communists. The communists, they're still there. The New People's Army has been resilient. They've been around since they used to call them the Hukbalap in the 1950s, and they're still there. They're still influential in certain areas, certain specific and rural areas, because of the poverty, because of the lack of distribution of resources. And then you have the Muslim uh, insurgents, if you will, in various parts of Mindanao, and they have always been very strong advocates for self-rule, and so that's driven largely by Islamic nationalism. There was a lot of talk during the counterterrorism days after post 9/11 that these groups are really international terrorists. They were largely local terrorists, but it was convenient for the governments to talk about them as international terrorism. There was talk about the establishment of the Islamic State in Mindanao and all that. But the fact is they were mostly local terrorists. And then on top of that, you have really what are just simply criminal gangs that use terroristic methods. And these are the groups that are kidnapping people and taking them for ransom and things like that. So you really have three different distinct groups of insurrectionists, if you will, from a central government perspective. But the fact is that their objectives are very different, and they've never really been able to collaborate with each other. So in some respects, they're ineffective in trying to gain national influence, but they're very effective in maintaining local influence over specific communities.
Yeah, and the central government is ineffective in terms of trying to control them.
Yeah.
So one thing that we ought to touch on before we move to the international interaction with China is the level of education. My understanding is that education is not a big thing in the Philippines, and something like a quarter of all the kids growing up in the Philippines never see the inside of a classroom, never. So they wind up, unskilled and kind of footloose and fancy free on the streets. And this is a big problem because a lack of education perpetuates itself. And I suppose the people on the wealthy side of the curve, they're happy enough, sort of like this country again. They're happy enough to see everybody uneducated and barefoot. Your thoughts about how that affects, um, you know, the culture and the prospects of the Philippines?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking largely rural areas. In the cities, the education system works more or less, not terribly effective because of lack of resources. But in the cities, it really the education system is there, and most kids become at least get through high school nowadays. But the a big part of the problem goes back to what we were talking about earlier about exporting wealth, because one of the big things that happens if you do get educated in the Philippines, there's a lack of jobs, and so you end up going overseas. And so a lot of the skilled workers and educated people move out of the Philippines, and you see that there's any number of Philippine nurses that are staffing the hospitals around the world, and there's any number of Philippine engineers that have worked in the oil fields in Libya and Saudi Arabia, Qatar, around the Middle East, and so part of the problem is they export the people who are educated, and they don't really have the ability to employ them at home. So that's another part of that export wealth problem that I was talking about earlier. But yeah, and you do have the rural communities are poorly educated for whatever reason, and they don't have the resources in the school. There's no real motivation for the kids to go to school because they have to stay home and work the uh, rice plantations. So and there's no incentive to get a good education if you live in some of those rural areas, and that leads to recruitment by the New People's Army, by the communists, by the Islamic rebels, and so yeah, so it is a big problem.
Yeah. I wish I could see some light at the end of that tunnel, Carl, but I don't. It doesn't. It doesn't sound like it's the kind of a place you want to move to. And there's tons of videos on YouTube about Americans that have moved to the Philippines, and a few months later, they're really unhappy with that decision. In fact, for that matter, I think there's a question of personal security for tourists, for people in general in the Philippines, where you might run into trouble that way. And so that mm, that diminishes the possibilities for a tourist industry as well. Even though the natural resources are spectacular, the fact is that it may not be the kind of thing where big hotels are going to invest.
Well, there is. Having said that, there are several nice secluded resorts in areas of the Philippines. In the central islands, there's nice big secluded resorts, and they are sort of self-contained resorts because there is the concern over security and yeah. So, but yeah, tourism they've worked hard on tourism, but the most successful tourism that they've had is Northeast Asians coming to gamble. And so you have two fairly significant areas in Manila that have developed around casinos, which are really built to gambling tourists coming from Northeast Asia.
My experience with the Philippines dates back into I want to say the 60s. And what I remember is if you wanted to have a reasonably secure residence, you had to get into a gated community that had shards of glass cemented on the wall so nobody could get in. And then there were people with machine guns everywhere, outside of the stores, outside of these communities, outside of all the bases. Um, and there was the risk that that wouldn't work either. But there were an awful lot of guns on the street. Is that still the case? Do you know?
Yeah, it is. I mean, the Philippines is very much a gun culture. Unlike a lot of other areas. But even today, when you drive to your hotel, you get let in with a guard carrying a gun, and they do this performative sweep under the vehicle to make sure you don't have a bomb in your car. And yeah, it's still there. I can tell you the story when I was there in the 70s. Uh, when you went to the movie theater, there was a place to check your gun. And so at the ticket booth, you had a whole rack of guns sitting in the background because you couldn't take your gun into the theater. So yeah, so it still is. I mean, even in the rural areas, the politicians ride with an armed convoy. So jeeps are still prevalent there, and so you've got the guys hanging off the back end of the jeep with M16 or AR-15s wrapped around the back. It's still there.
Yeah, we could have that. We could have that. We could have
Yeah.
that right here. So, one thing you mentioned early on in this discussion about the media and how, it might not be reliable in terms of reporting the news or resisting the corruption. But then there's Maria Ressa, who won a Nobel Peace Prize of some kind and who is world famous and who has been to Hawaii, who is super articulate. How will I say this? She's a model journalist, a global model journalist. What does she represent? Is she alone? Are there others like her? Is she going to, as a model journalist, is the kind of journalist like Maria Ressa going to prevail, or is she just a figment?
I mean, Maria Ressa has her own sort of aura. I agree. She's very much what's the word I'm looking for? She's an elite journalist, and she lives like an elite journalist and acts like an elite journalist. And so that with that, what that means, I think, is that she has this idealistic version of democracy that doesn't really quite reflect what's happening in the Philippines. It certainly has an aspirational feel to it, and yeah, I mean, Maria Ressa, I think, would be very, very critical. She would probably have joined the 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 contrarians in the United States, if you're familiar with the contrarians.
Sure.
I think
Yeah.
she's very much similar. She reminds me of Jennifer Rubin in some ways.
Yeah, she's definitely a hero.
Yeah.
You hope she won't be assassinated, and you hope there'll be others like her, that she will somehow stir up young people, to seek a more democratic result.
Yeah, and I think maybe 15 years ago I would have agreed with that, but I think today, the way the United States, but even more so the Philippines, has become so politicized that almost everything you see her write, it reflects a point of view that is no longer seen as idealistic and aspirational. It's seen as political. And I think that's the sad part of what's happening there and what's happening here. I mean, the big newspaper, the big media companies have simply foregone this idea of a neutral approach to the news and have become politicized, and so it becomes very, very difficult to be a honorable journalist in that sort of environment. And that's why I say she almost reminds me of the contrarians in the United States, where they've simply given up on big media. And when you do that, you sacrifice your visibility and you sacrifice your ability to influence large swaths of the population because they're simply not interested in what you have to say because it's not what you want to hear.
Oh, so true. Thank you for that. So let's move to China. China, South China Sea. China very interested in areas that Philippines claim, and furthermore that the United Nations has agreed belong to the Philippines as a matter of international law. But China doesn't reflect that, respect that, and China keeps on, making trouble in the South China Sea. And I guess the canary in the coal mine on that one is the Sierra Madre, which is an old rusting hulk that the Philippine government uses as a kind of outlier, an outreach of its sovereignty, which is just sitting there beached in some area which the Philippines claims. And the Chinese don't stop for a minute. Most recently, the news was reporting they were using fire hoses from the Chinese Coast Guard ships to any Filipino ship, either commercial or military, that was in the area. And on the basis of the the sort of the flawed government and the flawed sovereignty, if you will, that that goes too far, the flawed sovereignty of the Philippines, China, may I use Trump's term, holds all the cards, and the Philippines holds no cards, and it's a losing battle for the Filipinos. And I wonder if you could comment on why China is so interested in undermining the Philippines, in asserting its military power in that area, and why the Philippines is unable to stop them or even talk to them.
I've got to unpack what you said here because you're reflecting a viewpoint when the way you describe it, because it's obviously more complicated in the sense that China has this conflict with all the stakeholders in the South China Sea, specifically Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And why is it? I think the better question I want to answer is, why is the Philippines have so much attention and the other ones don't? Because I think that's part of what's happening here. Is, yes, the Philippines has certainly earned the wrath of the Chinese, much more so than Vietnam, even though the fact is Vietnam in the last 10 years has done more to reclaim land and build structures on these land features in the South China Sea than anybody else. But you don't hear about that because they do it quietly and they simply go about their business. The Philippines has consciously taken the approach of exposing any action by the Chinese in the South China Sea. And so what you're seeing is the result of that. You see the accusations because the Philippines is consciously making these apparent and visible to people in the media. So there's a Commodore Jay Fidell, a Coast Guard Commodore in the Philippines, whose job it is to expose these violations of so-called Philippine sovereignty in this area. And so this is very much a conscious effort. So they're being effective because they got your attention and they get the attention of the world to expose Chinese aggressive behavior in that region. While the others are still doing the same thing, they just aren't making it as visible. So I think that I want to make that little corrective to what you're saying, that yes, the Philippines is receiving a lot of attention from China. It's because the Philippines is making sure you get that information that they're being harassed by the Chinese. Now, having said all that, yeah, it is very much focused on Second Thomas Shoal, where the Sierra Madre is located, and then also on Scarborough Shoal, which is well within Philippines exclusive economic zone, where the Philippines is being fenced out from fishing access in the Scarborough Shoal, and the Chinese are doing that. Now, why are the Chinese doing that? Because they are basically making a territorial claim based on historic rights, which, as you said, it's not technically the UN, it's technically the arbitral tribunal formed from the UNCLOS, the United Nations Law of the Sea. What's the word I'm looking for? The UNCLOS arbitral tribunal, which was formed based on UNCLOS.
Hmm. So, with all of that, our look at the Philippines as a player in Southeast Asia, our look at China's aspirations and claims, and of course at the provocations by the Philippine government and Coast Guard and what have you. United States we were the uncle, we were the colonial power until they became independent, and even thereafter. They have a very close they have had, I'm not sure right now today, but they have had a very close relationship, dependency on the United States. And I wonder if the United States is doing enough. More specifically, whether the Trump administration is doing enough to protect them. You see these news stories, including 60 Minutes, which is a CBS news organization, which is under attack by the Trump administration. But
which
you
paid off the Trump administration.
yeah, paid off on a phony baloney claim. We've
Yeah.
seen that before. But I wonder if the United States could do more, whether it's doing enough to protect and support, and extend some power, to help the Philippines resist this thing going on in the South China Sea. It seems to me that the Chinese are becoming more aggressive all the time. This thing with the fire hoses, and they landed a flotilla of ships in Manila Harbor not too long ago, and they don't ask the Philippines for permission; they just do it. And my question is the U.S. Continuing to perform a role of protector and supporter and ally of the Philippines, or have we kind of turned our back on the Philippines?
No, I don't think so. I mean, first of all, we need to understand what is the U.S. interest here in the South China Sea. And first and foremost, the U.S. interest is maintaining freedom of navigation through those waters. That's the United States in the terms of UNCLOS. United States is a user state in the South China Sea. It's not a coastal state, which has territorial and economic claims. So first and foremost, the United States is interested in maintaining freedom of navigation. And there's a difference between the United States' version of freedom of navigation and China's version of freedom of navigation. So that's the first conflict between the United States and China. The first in terms of the United States' priorities. So when you see these operations, these freedom of navigation operations, and sailing through different parts of those waters, that's really the U.S.'s main interest. Now, what happened over the years is there's been a lot of disagreement or a lot of concern in the United States over the Philippines' territorial claims versus the Chinese territorial claims. And so during the Cold War, the United States never really clarified whether it would support the Philippines in the South China Sea versus China. And during the first Trump administration, you have to give them credit that they actually did clarify that any attack on a Philippine vessel in the South China Sea would be considered a violation of Philippine sovereignty. So that is a declared policy that was done by Mike Pompeo in 2020. And so that was actually a step in the direction of saying they will support the Philippines. Now, the United States has also offered to do joint patrols, but the Philippines has really resisted that because they see that as a provocation that they aren't prepared to take. But the United States has actually done a lot more in helping the Philippines in developing its claims in the South China Sea by saying that they would protect a Philippine vessel if it's attacked by China. So there has been support, but again, the Philippines is not fully ready to do joint patrols because it sees that as being provocative, and the United States, on the other hand, is still unwilling to talk about the territorial claims. But what it has done is it said it supports the 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling that those features do not warrant certain rights and responsibilities for territorial waters and economic zone claims. So I think that the United States has done a pretty good job of supporting the Philippines in promoting its claims and its rights as a coastal state, as a partner, as an allied partner.
Any change in the Trump administration?
So far, I haven't seen it. I mean, I don't think the Trump administration has been very focused on that part of the world at this point. I don't think it's done a freedom of navigation operation specifically claimed yet. So it's hard to say what's going to happen. I think it's fairly committed to the Philippine relationship. I mean, what we have seen, I think, interestingly, the United States has sort of maintained this something called the Luzon Economic Corridor, which is done in conjunction with the Japanese and the Americans to develop an economic corridor around the old military bases and Manila. So it is working on economic development with the Philippines, and it has also supported something called an emerging idea called the single theater concept for the East China Sea and the South China Sea with the Philippines, Japan, uh, and Australia. Controversial whether South Korea should be included in that. The Japanese version of that single theater concept does include South Korea. The Philippines doesn't want to include South Korea because that area is fraught with different sets of problems about a ground war on the Asian continent. But the fact is that the United States is supporting this idea of single theater concept, which allows Japanese and potentially South Korean support in the South China Sea for any aggressive action by China to actually take territory.
My recollection is that the Philippines is part of ASEAN,
Yeah,
but that it is not part of the Quad. Why not? Isn't it important for the security of the area to have the Philippines included in the Quad?
yeah, and and there's been talk about that, but and what they've come up with is the Squad, which talks about South Korea, Japan, the United States, and Australia and the Philippines. So there is movement, toward including the Philippines, and that goes to that single theater concept also. It's not part of the Quad, but again, the Quad, is a somewhat convenient alignment for reasons beyond just security. The maritime security is part of the Quad, but there's reasons why you don't want to expand that, mostly because of what the role India plays in the Quad.
Oh, so complicated. So, if you don't mind, I'd like to make you Secretary of State just for a moment, Carl.
Mhm.
As Secretary of State, what would you do to, enhance, improve, strengthen our relationship with the Philippines and thus our presence in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, and I think the answer is the economic assistance. I think is critical. Again, I mean, I'm always going to go back to saying the first thing we need to do is build an economic relationship, and so that would probably include not trying to put 17% tariffs on the Philippines, which we haven't talked about that yet. But the Philippines is one of the countries that has been working hard to find some level of agreement with the Trump administration, but hasn't done that yet. But I think it would be short-sighted to punish the Philippines for a trade imbalance. And so I think, first of all, continue to provide the economic support with China or with Japan and Australia accompanied, making it a broader multilateral approach to economic support, and also to continue to promote this single theater concept. That's a very important part of the United States being able to collaborate with not just a bilateral relationship with the Philippines, but to present a more robust deterrent effect on what China's doing in both South China Sea and the East China Sea. So I think that those two things are really key to supporting the Philippines. And then, of course, I mean, it would be great if we could develop a more robust, more effective, more efficacious political system in the Philippines. But it's pretty hard to do that given what's happening in our own country.
Yeah, it's hard to do that here.
Mhm.
Okay, Carl, what a great discussion. So important. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much to our guest, Carl Baker, Senior Advisor, Pacific Forum. I'm Jay Fidell, host of Global Connections, in this episode, which we are calling Getting Current on the Philippines. Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha. Aloha, Carl.